conference this year that the organizers decided to jump right in to make sure everybody has their chance to present. So we're doing the first session first before the opening and the plenary. So thank you all for coming. I'll give my informal thank you for coming. I'm Dick Norton. I'm the, wow, that's a squeaky door.
Maybe we should leave it open until the latecomers, all the latecomers.
Is there a share? Yes. I'm the chair of the Urban and Regional Planning Program at the University of Michigan in the States, and I'm also the vice president of PLPR now as well. So I'm here for multiple reasons. Right now, I'm the moderator. So if anybody walks through and it squeaks like that, we'll stop and give them all the evil eye. I'm the moderator for the session. We have 4 papers. I'll let the speakers all introduce themselves briefly to start off. Each paper will get 15 minutes, and then we'll do all 4 of them. I want to make sure all the speakers have a chance to present. And then we'll have just general open questions at the end of the session. So if you have a really burning point of clarification during the paper, feel free to ask. But otherwise, for general questions, please hold off, scribble them down, and we'll do them at the end of the session. So our first is Tessa Lynn, and you're on.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Tessa Lynn. I'm from the University of Reading, and my working title of my thesis is the intermediation of social relations of property, community right to bid. Okay, here's the structure of my presentation. I'm going to jump straight in because I'm already short of time. Okay, so in terms of the context behind my research, I sort of focus on discussions about individual and community rights in property and how they feature the distribution of resources and viewed as being an underlying cause of various types of war and poverty and wealth and prosperity. There are a great deal of campaigns calling out for alternative property rights and for property rights to be readdressed both in theory and in practice, and to address challenges as far-ranging from climate change to providing resilient local services. So the current situation of privatised and fragmented ownership structures worldwide has stemmed from a history of enclosure and public intervention with the underlying rationalisation of governance and modernisation of rights in order to facilitate and ultimately increase productive capacity. So this has led to the commodification of land and surplus value, with property becoming an investment vehicle with little or no consideration for the common good, thus causing unequal and inefficient distribution of rigid property rights, unsustainable land consumption, and an increased impact on the environment. So in short, the current dominant structure of property rights hinder the development of governance and management fit for 21st century challenges. Advocates for change have also seen the potential for alternative rights and management structures to be used exploitatively in a post-welfare society. The short-term focus on maximising monetary value and the lack of appreciation for the long-term resilience of communities is claimed to be detrimental to the future well-being of us as human beings and our communities. I'll very briefly touch on some of the theory which helps unpick these ideas. So the main disciplinary influence is sociology with a subdiscipline of social policy. And from this, I draw on the theories of neo-institutionalism, so for example, Patsy Healy and Eleanor Ostrom. And in particular, the research involves drawing on interdisciplinary theories relevant to community and ownership. An additional contribution to knowledge is made through the exploration of liberal property rights and broadly how the emergence of private property interrelates to sociology, contributing specifically to the social relations of property. Previous work on alternative forms of ownership within the property rights literature have been limited and characterised by rather simplistic assumptions and misconceptions about the nature of property rights. Okay, so ownership structures and governance arrangements, i.e. social institutions, have significant effects on the form, cost and nature of service provision and benefits derived from property and owning property, as well as the experience of place and social relations within neighbourhoods and between owners and users. But as Meinzendick and Gregorio state, property rights and collective action are undervalued and, when recognised, often misunderstood. It can be claimed that how we value property by using the market to determine price is socially and economically inefficient, particularly in terms of social impact and especially in terms of property that has a high non-monetary value attached to it. Measuring the value of collective action is also difficult to achieve because the benefits are often unique and unquantifiable. So increasingly it's becoming important for analysis and enrichment of land ownership and use to overcome this restrictive dichotomy of individual versus the state and public versus private property rights. By exploring the potential of such alternatives relating to broad concepts surrounding the commons as both a resource for communities but also governance structures to work together. The literature shows that there is the need for something new, a revitalisation of the old perhaps in terms of property rights and land use. Davey recommends the theory of polyrationality for progress towards appreciating the social side of property. He also highlights that we should be addressing what kind of property relations should policymakers prefer and should communities demand. Geisler states the importance as to why we should take a polyrational, plural approach to property because public interest is better served by an inclusive menu of ownership. An actor network theory is also a useful tool to conceptualise the social relations of property. Okay, so research into the commons has been influential on the property rights literature. Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons thesis is one that's been highly criticised by various different academics, particularly environmentalists, for being a propaganda for private ownership. It has also been criticised for failing to take into consideration the polyrational nature of property and particularly confuses with the difference between broadly stating open resources and common management. Ostrom and others revisited Hardin's work in 1990 concerning the governance of commons and resources, and that the rules and institutions of non-market can emerge from bottom up to ensure economically efficient, sustainable management of the resource. But the conditions and drivers involved in commons are different to urban England, where communities are fluid, relations are complex and uneven. This is where the theories of collaborative planning and institutional capacity complement Ostrom's institutionalist theories to make for a conceptual framework for my research. Okay, so my thesis examines the community right to bid, which was introduced in 2011 via the Localism Act and explores the nexus between legal and social relations of property rights, community action and values, and the ramifications that this policy tool that is claimed to be localist. So the community right to bid mechanism, it allows communities to register an asset of community value. Now the local authority manages this list and decides whether or not it can feature on the list. And if an owner wishes to sell this asset on the open market, they have to wait for 6 months for the community to be able to raise a bid to purchase the asset. So the list signifies the community have conferred value on the asset. Now, recently, the House of Commons Communities and Local Government Committee have recently carried out an inquiry into the community rights. And as you can see that just under 50% of the groups who have triggered a moratorium were unsuccessful in their bid. And this is a significant figure that needs to be investigated further. Okay, so I should highlight that this is a community right to bid, not to buy. So there's no first refusal to community groups, and nothing appears to be mentioned in the inquiry about how many landowners have actually refused to sell their asset, and this is something I will explore. Okay, so the key issues highlighted in the inquiry report that there needs to be a change to the permitted development rights to prevent, for example, a pub that's registered as an asset to be converted into a supermarket, because at the moment a community can register a pub as an asset, but the owner can actually convert that into a supermarket without it being taken into consideration that it's registered as value. Secondly, the recommendation is related to the first point, to make asset of community value a material consideration in planning applications. Currently, landowners are able to appeal against a listing, whereas nominating bodies aren't able to appeal against a refusal to list. And finally, it's been identified that a great deal of cases 6 months is not long enough for community organisations to raise funds to put together the bid. Therefore, it's recommended that this is increased to 9 months. Okay, so I carried out some scoping interviews with some representatives from the Department of Communities and Local Government and Locality, thank you. And Barry Quirk, who was the chair of the Quirk Review of Community Management and Ownership of Public Assets, who was quite influential in policy development on community ownership. Okay, so very quickly, the key findings were that we've moved from a demand-led to a supply-led in asset transfer. There's a rise in interest, not so much action. Policy interest is in motivation, so what motivates community groups and what are the personalities of these groups that are engaging in community ownership. And that there's a strong contrast in attitudes of public authorities towards asset transfer. And how do community groups get over the first hurdle and make their efforts sustainable? And finally, defining impact. Okay, so very short for time. So my research questions cover the sort of, without reading them off the board, but I'll just sort of briefly state what they're covering. Attitudes and perceptions towards ownership with the stakeholders involved. Motives, what are the motives of the people, including central government. Capacity, and almost like an evaluation of the community right to bid. And what is the impact of this in terms of the resilience and institutional community capacity? Okay, so my methodology, I'm currently at the stage of collecting the asset of community value applications from local authorities, and I will invite all local authorities to take part in a questionnaire. I will also submit questionnaires to nominating bodies and landowners to identify the questions to the answers to my research questions. I plan to carry out some case studies and some strategic interviews. Okay, so the observation so far is that the community right to bid is the only tool that community groups can use to purchase an asset that would otherwise simply be placed on the market without prior warning. And you can sort of see that the government there, there's a quote from DCLG saying that they're very encouraged with the success to date, the community rights overall, not just the community right to bid. Local authorities, the feedback is that they're under-resourced, and 20% of local authorities don't have any information of the community right to bid on their site. All very important, although sort of technical details that do make an impact on how these community rights get recognised by communities. Landowners, there's two representatives that took part in the inquiry. The British Property Federation are very supportive of this, whereas the Country Land and Business Association view it as counterproductive and illogical for both rural communities and landowners. These are all things I wish to explore in my research. Okay, so concluding thoughts. So in a time of economic recession and austerity and increasing demands on the third sector from politicians, there's been a series of calls for communities to take ownership of their areas and services, and increasingly innovative initiatives involving hybrid and alternative forms of ownership are creatively mobilised. This raises questions about whether new commoning is emancipatory or exploitative, and whether and how communities calculate the costs and benefits of being property owners. So the community right to bid maintains that legal ownership and private property virtually intact. And if social groups want to secure an asset, is this mechanism progressive? It's contended that in order to protect assets of community value and social relations of communities that are critically dependent on the existence of this asset, communities are being required to practice a form of enclosure through formal legislative means in order to protect these valued assets. This wave of new commoning, which on the surface challenges the logic of market mechanisms, has been viewed by some as the claim to rights to the city, as collective rights to change ourselves by changing the city more after our heart's desires. But this may also be seen as a neoliberalisation and marketisation of social relations of property, and as a last option if community assets and their lived wells are otherwise to be lost entirely. Therefore, the community right to bid may be read as part of a technology of governance practiced by successive UK governments to govern through the community. The danger of placing the onus on under-resourced communities to lead on planning for the resilience of their areas, and in particular to take ownership of assets and services, could in fact leave communities more vulnerable, particularly with the conflicting values and motives of the other stakeholders involved. This raises questions about whether communities are equipped to face the challenges of self-management, but also rational choice questions about why should they do this? Okay, so overall government efforts to pass on power and responsibility by the means of self-help, neoliberal motives seen in the community right to bid are faltering, and ownership in its broadest sense is viewed as a burden. In some cases we are witnessing community failure on top of market and state failure. So what happens to these communities and assets when tools such as the community right to bid fail for whatever reason? And finally, what are the motives of the government and capacity of the state in neoliberal terms versus the motives of and capacities of the community? And what impact does this have on community resilience? Thank you.
Nira, do you want to go ahead and set up your...
Well,
is Raquel?
to start.
Go ahead and set up, and while she's doing that,
Any burning comments?
so the folks who came in, we're going to hold off on discussion questions until the very end. But if anybody has a clarification question, I'm happy to entertain that now.
Could we keep the door open, Chair, because
Is
that
it-
was doing my head in.
Yeah.
It was quite difficult, yes. Thank you.
No, thank you, Tessa.
But it's quiet now.
Yeah.
We'll keep it that way.
Oh, there's my giants.